Plane crash survivors hunted by wolf pack for 6 days straight. The Twin Otter aircraft shuddered violently as it fought against the howling Alaskan wind. Through the small window, John Whitaker watched the endless white expanse below, a frozen wasteland that stretched beyond the horizon like a vast graveyard. He gripped his rifle case tighter, feeling the familiar weight of his hunting gear in the cargo hold behind him. At 42, John had spent more time in Alaska's wilderness than most people spend in their own homes. His weathered face told stories of countless hunting expeditions, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of years squinting against snow glare and Arctic wind. "Rough weather today," shouted the pilot over the engine noise. "Should smooth out once we clear these mountains." John nodded but said nothing. He'd made this flight dozens of times, varying between remote oil sites and civilization. As a wolf hunter contracted by the state, he'd learned to read the wilderness like others read newspapers. Today, something felt wrong. The wind patterns were too erratic, the clouds too low and heavy. His instincts, honed by 15 years of tracking predators through the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, were screaming warnings. Behind him sat 6 oil workers heading back to the Prudhoe Bay facility after a 2-week rotation. Riley Thompson, a barrel-chested rig supervisor with 20 years under his belt, was arguing with someone over the radio about equipment delays. At 51, Riley had worked oil rigs from Texas to the North Sea, and his gruff exterior hid a sharp mind that had saved countless lives in industrial accidents. His thick hands, scarred from years of manual labor, gestured emphatically as he spoke into the radio. Dakota Mills, the only woman on board, quietly checked her mechanical tools while her short blonde hair fell across weathered features that spoke of military service. At 34, she was one of the best heavy equipment mechanics in Alaska, her skills honed during 2 tours in Afghanistan where she'd kept military vehicles running under impossible conditions. Her green eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with the alertness of someone who'd learned that danger could come from anywhere. Elijah Brennan, the company geologist, studied topographical maps despite his arthritis-gnarled hands. At 62, he'd mapped more of Alaska's underground than any man alive, his geological surveys opening up billions of dollars in oil reserves. His silver hair and thick glasses gave him a professorial appearance that belied his decades of fieldwork in the harshest conditions imaginable. Beside him, young Sawyer Grant bragged loudly about his weekend plans in Anchorage, his cocky smile irritating everyone within earshot. At 25, Sawyer was a roughneck with more confidence than experience, his athletic build and movie star looks making him popular with the local women, but less so with his co-workers who had to clean up his mistakes. Cameron Walsh, the communications specialist, sat hunched over his laptop, trying to ignore Sawyer's chatter while fighting obvious anxiety about flying. At 28, Cameron was brilliant with electronics and satellite communications, but his pale complexion and nervous mannerisms suggested someone more comfortable with circuits than people. His thin fingers trembled slightly as he typed, whether from cold or nerves, John couldn't tell. The plane lurched sideways without warning, throwing Cameron against his window and causing Sawyer to spill coffee across his jacket. "What the hell was that?" Riley barked, his radio conversation forgotten. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, tension evident despite his professional tone. "Just some turbulence, folks. Tighten those seat belts." John felt it before he heard it, a subtle change in the engine's rhythm, like a heartbeat beginning to skip. His hunting instincts, honed by years in the wilderness where the smallest detail could mean the difference between life and death, screamed danger. The aircraft was losing power, and they were flying over some of the most remote territory in North America. "Engine failure," the pilot announced, his calm facade cracking. "Preparing for emergency landing. Everyone brace for impact." The next minutes passed in a blur of terror and mechanical chaos. The plane dropped like a stone, then caught air, then dropped again. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling like yellow flowers of death. Dakota helped Cameron with his mask while maintaining her own calm, her military training evident in her steady movements. Elijah gripped his armrest so hard his knuckles went white, his geological maps scattered across the floor. Sawyer's cocky demeanor vanished completely as he muttered prayers his grandmother had taught him back in Oklahoma. The pilot fought the controls with everything he had, trying to find a clearing in the endless forest below. Through the windscreen, John could see trees rushing up to meet them, their snow-laden branches reaching like grasping fingers. "Hold on," the pilot yelled, his voice breaking with strain. The Twin Otter hit the frozen ground at over 90 miles per hour. The first impact launched everyone against their restraints with bone-jarring force. The second impact, when the nose dug into a massive snowbank, threw them forward like rag dolls in a washing machine. Metal screamed against ice and rock as the aircraft tore through a grove of stunted spruce trees. The world became a kaleidoscope of spinning white and the thunderous roar of destruction that seemed to go on forever. Then, suddenly, silence. John opened his eyes to find blood trickling down his forehead from a gash just below his hairline. His ears rang like church bells, but he was alive. Around him, groans and cries pierced the eerie quiet that followed the crash. The plane had come to rest tilted at a severe angle, its nose buried deep in snow while the tail section pointed skyward like a broken arrow shot from heaven. "Sound off," Riley called out, his supervisor instincts kicking in despite a nasty gash on his temple that leaked blood down his cheek. "Everyone alive?" One by one, they responded through the haze of pain and shock. Dakota had a dislocated shoulder but was conscious and alert, her military medical training already assessing her own injuries. Cameron was hyperventilating but appeared physically uninjured, though his hands shook uncontrollably. Elijah's left leg was clearly broken, the bone visible through torn fabric, his face gray with pain and shock. Sawyer had severe bruising across his chest where the seatbelt had caught him, but he was moving and coherent. Riley himself had a concussion but remained functional, his years of crisis management experience keeping him focused. The pilot didn't respond to their calls. John unbuckled himself carefully, testing each limb before putting weight on it. His ribs ached, probably cracked, and his left shoulder felt wrong, but nothing seemed broken. He crawled toward the cockpit through the debris-strewn cabin, stepping over scattered equipment and personal belongings. The front section had crumpled inward like an accordion. The pilot hung motionless in his harness, his neck bent at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the twisted metal that had been his instrument panel. John checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find, his fingers confirming what his eyes already told him. "He's gone," John announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The weight of their situation settled over them like a shroud. They were stranded in the Alaskan wilderness with limited supplies, multiple injuries, and no immediate hope of rescue. The nearest settlement was over 200 miles away through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Worse, they were flying a route that wouldn't be missed for at least 12 hours, and search efforts would be hampered by the same storm that had brought them down. "How bad is it out there?" Dakota asked, cradling her injured arm against her body. John peered through a cracked window at the world beyond their metal shelter. The landscape outside was a white hell, endless snow broken only by skeletal trees and jagged rocks that jutted from the frozen ground like broken bones. The wind howled with such ferocity that it shook the wreckage, and snow fell so heavily that visibility was near zero. "Bad," he said simply. "We're in the Brooks Range, probably 50 miles from anywhere. Storm's getting worse, and it's going to be dark soon." "The radio?" Cameron asked hopefully, his technical expertise making him the natural person to check their communications. Riley had already examined the cockpit equipment while John checked on the pilot. "Dead. Everything's dead. The crash fried all the electronics." They spent the next hour taking inventory and treating injuries as best they could with the aircraft's limited first aid kit. John's rifle had survived the crash, along with a box of 36 rounds of ammunition. They had some emergency rations, energy bars, dried fruit, and military-style meals ready to eat, but not enough for 7 people for more than a few days. Their winter gear was minimal since they'd expected to be in the air for only 2 hours. Most wore only light jackets over their work clothes, adequate for walking from building to building but useless against the Arctic wilderness. Dakota fashioned a sling for her dislocated shoulder using torn fabric from a seat cushion, her movements precise despite the pain. She'd reset dislocated joints before, both on herself and others, during her military service. Riley helped her pop the shoulder back into place, a procedure that left her pale and sweating but functional. As night fell with the suddenness of the Arctic winter, the temperature inside the wreckage plummeted. Even with the wind partially blocked by the aircraft's hull, their breath formed clouds, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows. They huddled together for warmth, but John could see hypothermia setting in. Elijah's broken leg was turning blue despite their attempts to splint it, and Cameron's anxiety was giving way to the dangerous lethargy that preceded freezing to death. "We can't stay here," John told them, his breath visible in the frigid air. "This plane's going to be a metal coffin. We'll freeze to death before morning." "Are you insane?" Sawyer protested, his earlier bravado replaced by very real fear. "It's a blizzard out there. We can't see 10 feet. And it's -20 in here and getting colder," John shot back. "That storm will pass, but hypothermia won't wait. We need shelter, and we need it now." Dakota supported him despite her injury, her military survival training aligning with John's assessment. "He's right. I've been in situations like this before in Afghanistan. The plane won't protect us from the cold much longer. Metal conducts heat away from your body faster than being outside would." Reluctantly, they prepared to venture into the storm. John fashioned a crude splint for Elijah's leg using broken seat parts and torn fabric, wrapping it as tightly as he dared to prevent further damage. Riley and Dakota would help support the injured geologist between them, taking turns bearing his weight. Cameron carried what supplies they could gather: the first aid kit, emergency rations, and some tools that might prove useful. Sawyer was assigned to help wherever needed, his youthful strength an asset despite his inexperience. John took point position, rifle ready and senses alert. Not because he expected immediate danger from wildlife. Most animals would seek shelter in weather like this. But his hunter's instincts were screaming warnings he couldn't quite identify, some primal awareness that they were not alone in this wilderness. The moment they stepped outside the wreckage, the wind hit them like a physical blow from an angry giant. Snow stung their faces like tiny needles driven by hurricane-force gusts, and the cold bit through their inadequate clothing within seconds, finding every gap and seam. Visibility was less than 10 feet in any direction, turning the world into a swirling white void where direction became meaningless. "Stay together." John had to shout to be heard over the storm. "Follow my tracks exactly. Don't wander off even a few feet." They stumbled through knee-deep snow that concealed rocks, fallen logs, and other hazards. Every step was agony as the cold seeped through their boots and clothing. Elijah's weight made progress painfully slow, but no one complained. They understood with crystal clarity that leaving him behind meant death, not just for him, but potentially for all of them if the group dynamic fell apart. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, John spotted a dark shape ahead through the swirling snow, a small cave formed by fallen rocks and overgrown with ice formations. It wasn't much, barely large enough for all 7 of them, but it would block the wind and provide crucial insulation from the deadly cold. "There," he pointed, his voice nearly lost in the wind. They collapsed inside the shallow shelter, gasping and shivering uncontrollably. The cave was barely large enough for all 7 people, forcing them to huddle together like refugees. But it cut the wind significantly and felt like a palace compared to the hellish conditions outside. John immediately began gathering what dry wood he could find within the cave. Bits of deadfall that had been protected from the snow, some birch bark that would serve as tinder. Dakota helped arrange the injured while Riley organized their meager supplies. "Can you get a fire going?" Riley asked through chattering teeth, his breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. John nodded, pulling waterproof matches from his hunting gear. Fire meant the difference between life and death in these conditions. The first 3 attempts failed as wind gusts invaded their shelter, blowing out the fragile flames before they could catch hold. The 4th attempt caught, and soon they had a small but precious fire crackling in the back of the cave. For the first time since the crash, they could think beyond immediate survival. John studied their faces in the flickering firelight, reading the exhaustion, fear, and determination written in their expressions. These were oil workers, tough people used to harsh conditions and dangerous work. But this was different. This was nature at its most merciless, and they were woefully unprepared for the challenge ahead. "What's our plan?" Dakota asked, her military background showing in her direct approach to crisis management and strategic thinking. "First, we survive tonight," John replied, feeding another piece of wood to their precious fire. "Tomorrow, if the storm clears, we head south toward the Dalton Highway. It's our best chance of finding help." "How far is that?" Elijah asked weakly, his voice strained with pain from his broken leg. 40, maybe 50 miles through this terrain." John didn't mention that with Elijah's broken leg, their lack of proper gear, and the brutal conditions, it might as well be 500 miles. The highway represented their only hope, but reaching it would require everything they had and more. 50 miles, Cameron repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "In this weather, with our injuries, how long will that take?" John considered the question carefully. "In good conditions, maybe 2 days of hard walking. In these conditions, with our situation." He paused, not wanting to destroy their morale completely. "We'll take it 1 day at a time." As they settled in for the night, taking turns feeding their meager fire and trying to stay warm, John noticed something outside their shelter that made his blood run cold. In the snow just beyond the cave entrance, illuminated by the dancing flames, were tracks. Wolf tracks. Fresh ones, made since the snow had started falling. A pack had passed by recently, and they were large, larger than any John had seen in 15 years of hunting. The biggest track was nearly 6 inches across, indicating an alpha male of exceptional size and strength. The stride pattern suggested confidence, intelligence, and most troubling of all, curiosity about the human scent emanating from the cave. John said nothing to the others about his discovery. They had enough to worry about without adding the specter of predators to their list of immediate concerns. But as he took the first watch, rifle across his knees and eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond their fire, he knew their problems had just multiplied exponentially. The storm raged through the night with relentless fury, but occasionally, during brief lulls in the wind, John heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Howling. Not just one wolf, but several, their voices joining in an eerie chorus that spoke of pack coordination and hunting strategy. And they were closer than he liked. Much closer. Dawn came slowly, filtering through the still falling snow like gray twilight struggling through thick curtains. The storm had weakened but not broken, and the wind still carried the bite of Arctic cold. They could see perhaps 50 yards now, enough to navigate but not enough to spot danger until it was practically on top of them. "How's everyone feeling?" John asked as the others stirred from their fitful sleep around the dying embers of their fire. The honest answer was terrible, and it showed on every face. Elijah's fever suggested infection was setting in around his broken leg, turning his skin gray and clammy. Cameron's anxiety had worsened overnight, and he jumped at every sound, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. Sawyer had developed a harsh cough that echoed ominously in the confined space, his chest injury apparently worse than initially thought. Even Dakota, the toughest among them, moved stiffly from her shoulder injury and the effects of sleeping on frozen ground. They shared the last of their emergency rations, a meager breakfast of energy bars and dried fruit that only emphasized how desperate their situation was becoming. The food would be gone after one more meal, leaving them with nothing but melted snow for sustenance. "We move now," John announced, checking his rifle and gathering his gear. "The longer we wait, the weaker we get. And that storm could start up again any time." "What about Elijah?" Riley asked quietly, glancing at the geologist who was barely conscious despite the conversation happening around him. "We carry him as far as we can," John replied, but everyone heard the unspoken conclusion to that statement. It was a grim acknowledgement that everyone understood but no one wanted to voice. As far as they could might not be very far at all. They emerged from their shelter into a world transformed by the night storm. The landscape was entirely white, with drifts reaching waist-high in places and completely obliterating any landmarks they might have used for navigation. Every rock, every fallen log, every distinctive feature was buried under a blanket of snow that made the terrain both beautiful and deadly. John pulled out his compass and oriented himself southward, toward where the Dalton Highway should be. The instrument was one of the few pieces of technology that didn't depend on electronics or satellites, just magnetism and careful reading. In conditions like these, it might be the difference between life and death. They moved in single file, John breaking trail while the others followed carefully in his footsteps. The lead position was exhausting, requiring him to kick through snow, test each step for hidden obstacles, and maintain their heading while constantly scanning for threats. Progress was agonizingly slow, each step a battle against the deep snow and brutal cold. Every few hundred yards, they had to rest while Elijah gathered what little strength he had left. The old geologist was deteriorating rapidly, his face gray with pain and fever, his breathing shallow and labored. Riley and Dakota took turns supporting him, but his weight was becoming an increasingly serious burden on the group's survival chances. It was Dakota who first noticed they were being followed. "John," she called quietly during one of their rest stops, her voice carefully controlled. "Look at our back trail." John turned and felt his stomach drop like a stone. In the snow behind them, paralleling their path at about 100 yards distance, was a line of wolf tracks. The pack was shadowing them, staying just out of sight but close enough to monitor their progress, close enough to strike if the opportunity presented itself. "How many?" Riley asked, having overheard the exchange. John studied the tracks carefully, his hunter's experience allowing him to read the story written in the snow. "At least 6, possibly 8. Hard to tell with the wind filling in some of the prints." "Jesus Christ," Sawyer whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "What do they want?" John knew exactly what they wanted, but he kept his voice calm and professional. "Wolves are opportunists. They can smell the blood from our injuries, and they know we're struggling. They're patient hunters. They'll follow prey for days until exhaustion makes them vulnerable." "So what do we do?" Cameron asked, his voice rising toward panic. "We keep moving. We stay together no matter what happens. And we don't show fear." John checked his rifle, making sure a round was chambered. Fear is something they can sense, and it makes you look like prey. But John knew their situation was becoming impossible with each passing hour. Wolves were among the most patient hunters on Earth, capable of following prey for days until exhaustion, injury, or desperation made them vulnerable to attack. With an injured man slowing them down and their strength failing with each step, time was heavily on the predator's side. They pushed on through the morning, but their pace continued to slow as exhaustion and cold took their toll. Elijah was now semi-conscious, supported almost entirely by Riley and Dakota, his legs barely functioning. The rest stops became more frequent and longer as everyone struggled with the brutal conditions. It was just after noon when they first saw the wolves. John caught movement in his peripheral vision and turned to see a gray shape slipping between distant trees like a ghost made of smoke and shadow. Then another, moving with the fluid grace of apex predators in their element. The pack was closing in, growing bolder as they sensed weakness in their prey. There, Dakota pointed with her good arm. 2 o'clock, maybe 70 yards. A large wolf stood motionless among the trees, watching them with intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to look right through them. It was massive, easily the largest wolf John had ever seen in 15 years of hunting. The alpha male, no doubt, probably weighing close to 200 pounds of muscle, bone, and predatory intelligence. Behind it, other shapes moved like phantoms through the snow and shadows. "Nobody move suddenly," John whispered, slowly unshoulder his rifle. "Nobody run." Running triggers their chase response. The standoff lasted several tense seconds that felt like hours. The alpha studied them with an intelligence that was almost human, calculating odds and weaknesses, assessing threat levels and opportunity. Its scarred muzzle spoke of countless battles and victories, marking it as a survivor of the harsh Arctic ecosystem. Finally, it melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared, but John knew it hadn't gone far. The pack was still there, still watching, still following. "They're testing us," he explained as they resumed their painful march through the snow. "Seeing how we react, looking for weakness, checking our defenses." "Will they attack?" Cameron asked, his voice barely controlled. "Eventually, when they think the odds are in their favor." John's answer was brutally honest. Right now, they're just gathering information. That afternoon, as exhaustion really began to set in and their pace slowed to barely a crawl, the pack made its first probe. Cameron was struggling to keep up, falling behind the group despite everyone's encouragement, when something moved in the trees to their left. A wolf, not the alpha but a large female with silver-gray fur, emerged from cover and began paralleling their path at about 40 yards distance. She moved with confident ease through snow that was exhausting the humans, her powerful legs and broad paws carrying her effortlessly across the frozen landscape. "Just keep walking," John commanded, but his finger found his rifle's trigger and took up the slack. "Don't look directly at her. Don't show fear." The wolf paced them for several minutes, studying each member of the group with predatory interest. When her attention focused on Elijah, John saw calculation in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in the eyes of countless predators sizing up wounded prey. The animal could sense the man's weakness, could probably smell the infection in his wound, could detect the vulnerability that made him the most likely target. Suddenly, without warning, the wolf broke into a trot, angling toward the group with clear hostile intent. John's rifle came up smoothly, years of hunting experience guiding his movements. The shot echoed across the wasteland like thunder, the sound rolling off distant mountains and returning as ghostly echoes. The wolf spun and fell, her death cry piercing the air, a sound that was part pain, part surprise, part warning to her pack. Immediately, answering howls erupted from the forest around them, angry, challenging sounds that raised the hair on every neck and sent primitive fear racing through human nervous systems evolved to recognize that particular sound as mortal danger. "You just made them mad," Dakota observed, her military experience reading the tactical situation with professional clarity. "Better mad than bold," John replied, but he was already scanning the tree line for the next threat. "Mad wolves make mistakes. Bold wolves coordinate attacks." The pack's response was swift and sophisticated, revealing a level of intelligence that made John's blood run cold. Wolves appeared on both flanks now, staying just out of rifle range but clearly visible, a deliberate psychological tactic. They were being herded, driven towards some predetermined killing ground where the pack would have maximum advantage. "This is bad," Riley muttered, his supervisor's experience with crisis management telling him they were losing control of the situation. "They're trying to separate us, drive us where they want us to go." John knew the oil worker was right. Wolf packs were sophisticated hunters with complex strategies developed over thousands of years of evolution. They would try to isolate the weakest member, in this case Elijah, and force the group to make an impossible choice between abandoning him or risking everyone's life to protect him. As if summoned by his dark thoughts, the alpha male appeared directly ahead of them, blocking their path like a furry boulder. It was enormous, probably weighing close to 200 pounds of pure muscle and predatory intelligence. Scars crisscrossed its muzzle and ears, speaking of countless battles with prey, rivals, and perhaps even other predators. This was an apex predator in its prime, and it knew exactly how dangerous it was. "Can you take him?" Dakota asked quietly, her question purely tactical. John raised his rifle, but the wolf was smart, smarter than any animal had a right to be. It stayed just beyond accurate range for a guaranteed kill shot, weaving slightly to make a clean shot difficult. More wolves materialized from the forest around them. 6, 7, 8 of them, all moving with coordinated precision. They were surrounded, trapped in an open area with no cover and no escape route. "We need high ground," John decided, spotting their only chance of survival. "Something defensible where they can't surround us." He spotted what he was looking for, a cluster of large boulders about 200 yards to their right. The rocks would give them protection on multiple sides and limit the wolves' ability to attack from different directions simultaneously. "Move," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to life and death decisions. They broke for the rocks as the pack closed in with terrifying speed. John fired twice in quick succession, dropping one wolf and sending another limping into the forest with a yelp of pain. The remaining animals pressed their attack, snarling and snapping at the fleeing humans with predatory fury. Dakota, despite her injured shoulder, helped drag Elijah up onto the highest boulder, while the others scrambled for defensive positions. Riley and Cameron climbed with desperate energy, while Sawyer surprised everyone with his agility, reaching safety just as a wolf lunged for his legs. John came last, turning to fire again as a massive gray shape lunged for his position. The bullet caught the animal in mid-leap, and it crashed into the snow just feet from the rocks, its momentum carrying it almost to the base of their stone fortress. Now they were trapped on their rocky island while the pack circled below like sharks around a sinking ship. The wolves had learned to respect the rifle, staying just out of range, but they showed no signs of leaving. If anything, more were arriving. John counted at least 12 now, possibly more lurking in the trees beyond their line of sight. "How much ammunition do you have left?" Riley asked, his question cutting straight to the heart of their tactical situation. John checked his pockets carefully. 32 rounds. Against 12 or more wolves, it wouldn't be enough, especially since the animals were learning to use cover and maintain distance. The alpha was clearly intelligent, perhaps even experienced with human hunters. This wasn't their first encounter with armed humans. Night was falling again, and with it came the deadly cold that could kill them as surely as wolf fangs. Their situation was becoming impossible to resolve. They couldn't stay on the rocks. Exposure would kill them within hours. But they couldn't leave either. The wolves would slaughter them the moment they lost the tactical advantage of high ground. "There's got to be something we can do," Cameron said, though his voice suggested he didn't believe his own words. John studied the pack below, watching their movements and behavior patterns. The wolves were patient but not inactive. They were positioning themselves strategically, cutting off escape routes, setting up interlocking fields of fire like a military unit. The alpha had stationed itself directly between the rocks and the direction they'd been traveling. This wasn't random animal behavior. It was tactical planning. They're smart, he admitted, his respect for the predators grudging but genuine. Smarter than any pack I've dealt with in 15 years of hunting. What does that mean for us? Sawyer asked, his earlier cockiness completely gone. It means they've probably done this before. Humans aren't their usual prey, but they've learned we're vulnerable when we're injured and isolated. They know our weaknesses. As if to prove his point, the alpha raised its massive head and howled, a long, mournful sound that was answered immediately by the pack. But John heard something else in that otherworldly chorus. It wasn't just communication, it was coordination. The wolves were planning something, sharing information, preparing for a coordinated assault. They're going to rush us, he realized, his hunter's instincts reading the signs. Soon. When? Dakota asked, checking her own small sidearm, a .38 revolver with 6 rounds. Soon. They know we can't stay here much longer. Cold will do their work for them if they wait, but they're predators. They prefer to take action. The attack came at full dark, just as John had predicted. The wolves charged from 3 directions simultaneously, using the darkness and their superior night vision to mask their approach until the last possible moment. John's rifle barked repeatedly, muzzle flashes lighting the hellish scene like lightning during a thunderstorm. 2 wolves fell to his accurate shooting, but the others kept coming with relentless determination. Dakota's pistol added to the din as she fired at shapes moving in the snow below, her military training helping her remain calm under fire. Riley threw rocks with surprising accuracy, while Cameron and Sawyer shouted and waved their arms to appear larger and more threatening. The assault lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours of concentrated terror and violence. When it ended, 3 wolves lay dead in the snow around their rocky fortress, but the pack had achieved its primary goal. They'd forced the humans to expend precious ammunition and revealed their defensive capabilities for future reference. Worse, Elijah had deteriorated further during the chaos of the attack. The old geologist was now unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin taking on the gray pallor that spoke of approaching death. He was dying, and everyone knew it. "We can't save him," John said quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say. "Like hell we can't," Riley shot back, his loyalty to his team running deep. "Look at him, Riley. Really look. He needs a hospital, surgery, antibiotics. We can't give him any of that out here." It was a brutal truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge, but it hung over them like a death sentence. Elijah was going to die, probably within hours. When he did, the wolves would smell death on them, making them even more attractive targets for scavengers and predators. "So what are you suggesting?" Dakota asked, her military pragmatism warring with her human compassion. John's answer came hard, each word costing him something. "We leave him when the time comes. We can't carry a dead man, and we can't afford to have his death sent on us." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wolves seemed to sense the weight of the moment, their howling subsiding into an eerie quiet that was somehow more menacing than their earlier aggression. "Absolutely not," Riley said finally, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years leading men in dangerous situations. "We don't abandon people. That's not who we are." "Then we all die," John replied without emotion. "Is that better? Is that more honorable?" It was Cameron who broke the deadlock with a whispered observation that changed everything. "He's already gone," the communications specialist said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Look." Elijah had stopped breathing during their argument. The old geologist's long struggle was over, his body finally succumbing to blood loss, infection, and shock. His death was peaceful, a simple cessation of life's processes in the middle of the brutal wilderness. The death changed their tactical situation completely. Now they were 6, still trapped but no longer slowed by caring for a dying man. More importantly, They could move at night when the wolves' advantages were somewhat reduced, and their own desperation might give them an edge. "We go now," John decided, checking his remaining ammunition. "Before they realize what's happened, before they smell death on us." They climbed down from the rocks in darkness, leaving Elijah's body behind with whispered prayers and promises to send recovery teams when they reached civilization. It was a cruel necessity that would haunt them all, but survival demanded harsh choices that civilized people weren't trained to make. John led them away from the rocks in a different direction, hoping to confuse the pack and buy them time. For a while, it seemed to work. They made good progress through the snow, putting precious distance between themselves and their tormentors. But wolves have exceptional hearing and an even better sense of smell. Within an hour, John heard the dreaded sound of howling behind them, closer than before. The hunt was resuming with renewed intensity. They pushed through the night with the desperation of the truly doomed, exhaustion lending a strange energy to bodies that should have collapsed hours ago. Dakota's shoulder had stopped working entirely, forcing her to carry her pack one-handed and rely on Riley for support during difficult passages. Cameron was on the verge of complete psychological breakdown, jumping at every shadow and sound. Sawyer had grown quiet and grim, his earlier cockiness replaced by the grim reality of their situation. Only Riley remained steady, his supervisor's experience with crisis management serving him well. He took over navigation duties when John's attention was focused on their pursuers, keeping them oriented toward the distant highway that represented their only hope of survival. Dawn brought a partial break in the weather. The snow had stopped falling, and visibility improved dramatically for the first time since the crash. They could see the landscape stretching before them, an endless expanse of white broken by dark patches of forest and the occasional rocky outcrop. It was beautiful in a deadly way, like a painting of hell done in white and gray. "How much farther?" Sawyer asked, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. John consulted his compass and studied the terrain ahead, trying to match what he saw with his mental map of the region. 20 miles, maybe 25 to the highway. It might as well have been 1,000. They were exhausted, hungry, and still being stalked by the most persistent pack John had ever encountered. He could see wolf tracks in the snow around them, evidence that the animals had circled during the night to get ahead of them, to set up ambush positions along their route. "They're everywhere," Cameron whispered, his voice cracking with strain and terror. John nodded grimly. The pack had grown overnight. He counted at least 15 distinct sets of tracks now, some larger than others. Word had somehow spread through the wolf community that easy prey was available. They were facing not just one pack, but a coalition of predators drawn by the scent of blood, weakness, and desperation. The first attack of the day came at mid-morning, just as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time since the crash. John saw it developing, wolves emerging from a tree line ahead while others appeared on their flanks like gray ghosts, materializing from the landscape itself. It was a classic pincer movement designed to crush them between converging forces. "Run," he shouted, but there was nowhere to go that wouldn't lead them into another part of the trap. The wolves came from 3 directions at once, gray shapes bounding through the snow with deadly purpose and terrifying coordination. John's rifle cracked repeatedly, dropping 2 animals in quick succession, but there were too many coming too fast. A large male broke through their defensive line and leaped at Dakota with jaws wide and fangs gleaming. Riley intercepted the animal with a tackle that sent both of them tumbling into the snow in a tangle of limbs and fur. The wolf's jaws snapped inches from his face as they wrestled, its hot breath steaming in the cold air. Dakota drew her pistol with her good hand and fired, the bullet taking the wolf in the head at point-blank range, splattering them both with blood and brain matter. Meanwhile, Cameron had frozen in terror as a wolf charged directly at him, his feet rooted to the spot by paralyzing fear. Sawyer, surprising everyone with his courage and quick thinking, grabbed a broken branch and clubbed the animal aside just as it launched itself into the air. The wolf recovered quickly and turned on him with a snarl of rage, but John's rifle ended the threat with a shot that echoed across the wasteland. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, 4 wolves lay dead in the churned and bloody snow, but the victory was Pyrrhic at best. Riley had been badly bitten on his left arm, the wolf's fangs leaving deep puncture wounds that bled freely. Sawyer was bleeding from claw marks across his back where another wolf had raked him during the melee. Worse, John had expended 8 more precious rounds, leaving him with only 24 bullets against a pack that seemed to be growing rather than shrinking. "This isn't working," Dakota said, applying pressure to Riley's wounds with torn fabric from her jacket. "They're going to bleed us dry one bite at a time. Wear us down until we can't fight back." John knew she was absolutely right. The wolves were employing a strategy of attrition, weakening them with repeated attacks while avoiding decisive losses to their own numbers. Eventually, the humans would run out of ammunition, strength, or both. Then the pack would close in for the kill with overwhelming numbers. "We need to break their pattern," he decided, studying the terrain ahead for any advantage they could exploit. "Do something they don't expect, something that goes against their tactical assumptions." "Like what?" Riley asked through gritted teeth, his supervisor's mind already working on the problem despite his pain. John studied the landscape ahead with a hunter's eye for terrain and tactical advantage. A narrow valley cut through the terrain about a mile ahead, its sides steep and rocky. It would be perfect for an ambush, if they could get there first and if they could turn the tables on their pursuers. "We're going to set a trap," he announced. "Make them come to us on our terms instead of theirs." The plan was desperate but simple in its concept. They would enter the valley and position themselves where the wolves would have to attack uphill through a narrow passage, negating their numerical advantage and forcing them to come in single file. John would use his remaining ammunition to maximum effect while the others created as much noise and confusion as possible to disrupt the pack's coordination. It took all their remaining strength to reach the valley before the pack caught up. Their pace had slowed to barely a shuffle, and they left an obvious trail through the snow that a blind man could follow. But they reached the narrow entrance just as the first wolves appeared in the distance. John positioned Dakota and Cameron on one side of the passage, while Riley and Sawyer took the other, despite their injuries. He placed himself at the narrowest point with a clear field of fire and excellent cover behind a fallen boulder. It was a good defensive position, but it was also a trap for them as much as for the wolves. If his plan failed, they would be pinned in the valley with no escape route. The wolves appeared at the valley entrance within minutes, led by the massive alpha that had haunted their trail since the beginning. The animal studied the setup with obvious intelligence, its yellow eyes taking in the defensive positions and calculating odds. It recognized the trap for what it was, but apparently decided the weakened humans were worth the risk. The alpha's howl echoed off the valley walls like a war cry, and the pack charged with synchronized precision that spoke of countless successful hunts. John's first shot dropped the lead animal, but others leaped over the body without breaking stride. His second shot missed as a wolf dodged between rocks with predatory agility. His third and fourth brought down 2 more attackers, but the pack kept coming in a gray tide of fury and fangs. Dakota and Riley threw rocks and shouted, trying to confuse the animals and disrupt their attack formation. Cameron, his breakdown now complete, simply screamed in primal terror that somehow seemed to have an effect on the charging wolves. Sawyer had found a large stick and was swinging it like a club, his athletic coordination serving him well in close combat. John's rifle continued to bark as he picked his targets carefully, making every shot count. A wolf fell here, another there, but they kept coming with relentless determination. His ammunition counter was running down fast. 15 rounds, 10-8. The alpha gathered itself for a final leap just as John's rifle clicked empty. For a split second, predator and prey locked eyes across the bloody snow. Then Sawyer's improvised club caught the massive wolf across the skull with a crack like breaking timber. The alpha staggered, shook its head, and lunged again, only to meet Dakota's pistol at point-blank range. Her last bullet took the pack leader in the chest, the impact driving it backward into the snow where it lay still, its yellow eyes finally closing. Suddenly, as if a switch had been thrown, the remaining wolves broke off their attack. Without their leader, the pack's coordination collapsed completely. The animals melted back into the forest like smoke, leaving their dead behind and abandoning the hunt that had cost them so dearly. For several minutes, nobody moved or spoke. The silence was deafening after the chaos of battle. Then Dakota began to laugh, not from humor but from pure relief, exhaustion, and the psychological aftermath of mortal combat. "Is it over?" Cameron asked weakly, his voice barely a whisper. John ejected his rifle's empty magazine and looked at the carnage around them. 8 dead wolves lay in the snow, including the massive alpha that had led the hunt from the beginning. The surviving pack members were nowhere to be seen, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had finally lifted. "For now," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. They rested in the valley for several hours, tending wounds and trying to recover what little strength they had left. Riley's arm was badly infected despite their attempts at field medicine, but he could still travel. Sawyer's back wounds were painful but not life-threatening, though they would need proper medical attention soon. Cameron remained shaky but functional, the successful defense having given him back some measure of confidence. When they finally emerged from the valley, the landscape looked different somehow. The oppressive feeling of being hunted was gone, replaced by the normal stillness of winter wilderness. They were no longer prey in the eyes of the local ecosystem. They had proven themselves predators capable of fighting back. The final push to the highway took 2 more days of brutal travel through deep snow and sub-zero temperatures that tested the limits of human endurance. They walked during the day when visibility was best and huddled together for warmth at night, burning whatever wood they could find in small fires that provided more psychological comfort than actual heat. Their emergency rations were long gone, forcing them to melt snow for water and ignore their growing hunger as their bodies began consuming muscle mass for energy. John showed them which plants might be edible and how to recognize animal tracks that could lead to food sources, but winter in Alaska offered few options for foraging. On the 3rd morning after the valley battle, they crested a low hill and saw the most beautiful sight imaginable, a thin black line cutting through the white landscape like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. The Dalton Highway, also known as the Hall Road, stretched from Fairbanks to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. "There," John pointed with a shaking hand that had nothing to do with the cold. "We made it." They stumbled down the hillside like walking scarecrows, their clothes torn and their faces gaunt with exhaustion and hunger. But they were alive and they were together, and they had survived an ordeal that would have killed lesser people. A truck driver spotted them flagging traffic and pulled over, his eyes wide with amazement at their condition. Within hours, they were in a hospital in Fairbanks, being treated for exposure, malnutrition, infected wounds, and various injuries sustained during their ordeal. The rescue team that went back for Elijah's body found the crash site exactly as John had described. But they also found something else that validated their incredible story: the remains of the wolf pack's kills scattered around the area. Caribou, mostly, but also the carcasses of 2 moose and several smaller animals. The severe winter had driven the normally territorial packs together in desperation, creating the super pack that had stalked the survivors across miles of wilderness. "You faced something unprecedented," the state wildlife biologist explained to John as he recovered in his hospital bed. "Climate change has disrupted normal prey patterns, forcing wolves to adapt their hunting strategies in ways we're only beginning to understand. What you encountered was probably a one-time event, a perfect storm of circumstances." John nodded, but said nothing about the intelligence he'd seen in the Alpha's eyes, the coordination of the pack's attacks, or the tactical sophistication of their pursuit. These weren't just animals following instinct. They were strategic thinkers adapting to new circumstances with frightening efficiency. The media picked up the story, turning their survival into a minor sensation. Reporters wanted to know every detail of their ordeal, their escape, their battle with the wolf pack. But John found he had little to say to them. How could he explain the bone-deep cold that made thinking difficult? How could he describe the weight of Elijah's death on their conscience? How could he convey the primal terror of being hunted by intelligent predators? 6 months later, John returned to his cabin in the wilderness, but something had changed. The woods that had once felt like home now seemed different somehow, more dangerous, more unpredictable. He never went hunting alone again, and he always carried extra ammunition. The experience had taught him that in nature's brutal arithmetic, humans were just another variable in the equation of survival. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howled through the trees around his cabin, he would remember the sound of wolves calling to each other across the frozen wasteland. And he would check that his doors were locked, his rifle loaded, and his fire burning bright against the darkness that lay beyond the thin wall of civilization. Riley returned to supervising oil rigs, but he carried the scars of wolf fangs on his arm and a new respect for the power of nature. Dakota went back to her mechanical work, though she kept a larger sidearm in her toolbox and took wilderness survival courses in her spare time. Cameron left Alaska entirely, moving to a desk job in Phoenix where the only predators were corporate and the wilderness was limited to cactus gardens. Sawyer surprised everyone by becoming a wilderness guide, his experience on the trail giving him credibility with clients who wanted authentic adventure. He never forgot the lesson that courage often meant acting despite fear, not the absence of fear itself. The wilderness was still out there, patient and eternal, waiting for the next group of humans foolish enough to think they had conquered it. John had learned the hard truth that every hunter eventually discovers. In the wild, you're only the predator until something bigger, smarter, or hungrier decides you're not. He'd survived the hunt, but he knew it was really the wild that had let him go. This time, years passed, and the story became legend among bush pilots and oil workers. Some details were embellished, others forgotten, but the core truth remained. 6 people had walked into the Alaskan wilderness with nothing but their wits and determination, faced down a pack of wolves, and lived to tell the tale. But John knew the real story was more complex than any legend could capture. It wasn't just about survival skills or marksmanship or courage under fire. It was about the thin line between civilization and chaos, about how quickly modern humans could be reduced to their most primitive instincts when stripped of technology and comfort. Most of all, it was about respect for the power of nature, for the intelligence of wild animals, and for the harsh reality that in the end, survival often came down to brutal choices that civilized people were never trained to make. The hunt was over, but the lessons would last forever. In the wild, there were no second chances, no do-overs, no appeals to higher authority. There was only the eternal struggle between predator and prey, played out against a backdrop of stunning beauty and merciless indifference. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of Alaska, new packs were forming, new strategies were being developed, and the ancient dance of hunter and hunted continued as it had for thousands of years. The only difference was that now, both sides had learned something new about each other. The wild was patient, the wild was intelligent, and the wild never forgot. The end. We encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and explore our channel for a diverse range of content, including audiobooks, murder mysteries, psychological thrillers, and classic novels. We strive to provide comprehensive and engaging storytelling experiences. Your visit is highly appreciated, and we are confident you will find content to your liking.